I love watching HGTV. You know, the Home and Garden channel that has shows like House Hunters International, Love It or List It, Property Brothers, you name it, I watch it all. I'm not quite sure why I'm so obsessed with the shows, but I am. One thing I've noticed when potential buyers are house hunting or owners are remodeling on these shows is they always want lots of storage. Lots of storage. From oodles of cupboards and pantries in their kitchens, to giant walk-in closets in the bedrooms, to attics and basements that can hold more than could possibly be used, people want storage. Today's readings made me think about this pursuit of storage, especially the parable from Luke's gospel that we just heard. Now, sometimes Jesus' parables can be difficult to understand, but this one is pretty straightforward. In fact, before sharing the parable, Jesus tells his listeners what the moral of the story is. Don't be greedy. Life isn't about having a lot of stuff. The parable goes like this. A rich man, notice, he's already rich. He has so much land that becomes so fruitful, he decides he needs to tear down his existing barns and build even bigger ones so that he can have more storage. He then says to himself, now that he's stored up so much for himself, he can eat, drink, and be merry, which is actually a quote from the book of Ecclesiastes that we heard a passage from today. Then, while this rich man is kicking back and reveling in all of his stuff, God shows up and calls the man a fool, saying that he is going to die that night. Will having all that stuff have mattered if he's about to die? I think most of us have a lot more stuff than we need. We often do what the rich man in the parable did. We buy bigger homes with more storage. We fill our basements with all kinds of things we don't need. And we even rent storage units for all the stuff that doesn't fit in our homes. Now, I recognize that sometimes this is necessary. There might be all kinds of circumstances in which we do require more room to accommodate the needs of our families. But I know that in my own experience, I have accumulated so much more than I need. The house that my husband and I lived in with our children for 20 years had an attic and a full basement. When we finally decided we needed to sort through everything in those spaces, it was embarrassing how much we had. We found things we thought we might need someday, and of course, never did. We found broken things that were never going to be repaired. We found things that had deteriorated due to not being used. And we found plenty of things that we didn't even remember we had. It was liberating when we decided to get rid of all that stuff. We were ruthless in letting things go. We sold and recycled and donated all sorts of things. And it felt so good to not be weighed down by so much stuff and to know what I had in my home and keep only what I thought we would use. Of course, we still have so much more than we need, and I've realized that the new home that we've been in for the past 8 years is starting to accumulate more than I'd like. It's time to do some cleaning. Today's parable, along with the other readings we heard, tells us that it's not really all the stuff that we accumulate that's the problem. The problem is when we begin to think the stuff itself is what is most important in our lives. When we think it is things rather than relationships, including our relationship with God, that will make us happy In the parable of the rich fool, after God tells the man he will die that night, God says this, "So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." The rich fool was focused only on himself and his material well-being. That was the problem. Our other readings today hammer home this message that greed, our selfish obsession with material wealth, is a problem. The psalm refers to the wickedness of those who put their trust in their goods and boast of their great riches. Paul's letter to the Colossians bluntly condemns greed and identifies it as a kind of idolatry, when our wealth becomes our God. And the book of Ecclesiastes observes that most of our human efforts are just vanity. The passage from Ecclesiastes that we heard today left out, you'll notice, look at the numbers, it left out a whole chunk, the first 17 verses of chapter 2, in which the author describes an experiment in gathering as much wealth as he could. He built houses and vineyards. He amassed giant herds and flocks and a huge store of silver. He owned slaves and became greater than anyone else in Jerusalem. But in the end, as we see in today's passage, he considered all of this worthless, a vain striving toward something that was ultimately meaningless. He calls it vanity. The Hebrew word that is translated vanity, the word is hebel. It means something like vapor, something that is unsubstantial and does not last. 3 of our readings today remind us that in the end, we all die. We can't take all this stuff with us. And there's something else that's more important, more lasting than material goods. Of course, we need stuff, but the consistent message in Scripture is to not become too attached to it, to not be seduced into believing that wealth is the measure of our worth or of our goodness as people. Instead, we need to recognize and nurture what is truly valuable in our lives. As the rich fool is told, we need to become rich toward God. What does that mean, to be rich toward God? Well, if we believe that God is love, then it surely means that we need to focus our efforts on being more loving, more compassionate, more giving. We should focus less on gathering things only for ourselves and more on sharing what we have with others. And it is not just things that we store up in unhelpful ways. Sometimes we store up feelings like anger, resentment, guilt, fear, jealousy. Some of us have closets full of these negative emotions. So let's downsize a little. Let's try to focus a little less on our stuff. And let's try to let go of those feelings that separate us from each other and from God. Let's do a little remodeling of ourselves and make room in our lives for something new, something more lasting and life-giving that will make us rich toward God. I'd love to see that show on HGTV.